Notice how differently certain conversations unfold now. Someone questions your decision. Someone misunderstands your intention. Someone challenges a direction you've chosen for your life. In the past, moments like this often triggered an immediate reaction. You felt the need to explain, to clarify what you meant, to make sure the other person understood your reasoning, not necessarily to win an argument, but to restore the correct image of who you were and what you were doing. If someone doubted your competence, you explained your experience. If someone criticized your choices, you outlined your logic. If someone misunderstood your motives, you corrected the narrative. And in many cases, you did this calmly. But underneath the explanation, there was a quiet pressure, a sense that your value needed to be recognized, that your choices needed to be justified, that your intentions needed to be understood. This pressure often appeared in subtle ways. You might add extra context to a story to make sure it sounded reasonable. You might emphasize certain accomplishments to prevent being underestimated. You might clarify your position in conversations even when no one directly asked you to. The behavior wasn't arrogance. It was self-protection. Carl Jung believed that when the ego feels uncertain about its own worth, it compensates through performance and explanation. The ego attempts to secure recognition from the outside world. Approval becomes reassurance. Agreement becomes confirmation. Understanding becomes emotional validation. When that validation appears, the psyche relaxes. When it doesn't, the ego may feel the need to defend its position. Earlier in life, this dynamic often happens automatically because identity is still being formed. You learn who you are partly through the way others respond to you, through their reactions, their recognition, their respect. These reflections become mirrors. And for a long time, those mirrors help stabilize the ego. But depending entirely on external mirrors has a consequence. When someone misunderstands you, it feels destabilizing. When someone doubts you, it feels threatening. When someone dismisses your perspective, it feels like your identity is being challenged. So you respond, you explain, you defend, you clarify. Sometimes the conversation resolves. Sometimes it doesn't. But either way, a significant amount of psychological energy becomes invested in being correctly understood. Over time, you may have noticed how exhausting this can be. The need to constantly manage how others perceive you. The need to ensure your intentions are interpreted accurately. The need to demonstrate that your choices make sense. Carl Jung believed that individuation gradually dissolves its dependence on external confirmation. As identity becomes internally consolidated, the ego stops relying so heavily on outside validation. Instead of asking, "Do they understand me?" the psyche begins asking a different question. "Do I understand myself?" This shift changes the entire structure of how you respond to misunderstanding. Someone may still question your decisions, but the internal pressure to defend them weakens, not because you lack conviction, but because your conviction no longer depends on agreement. You know why you made the choice. You know the values guiding your direction, and that internal clarity removes the urgency to persuade others. For example, imagine someone expressing skepticism about your career decision. Earlier, you might have felt compelled to explain the long-term reasoning, the research you did, the effort you invested, the vision behind the choice. Now the response may be much simpler. You acknowledge their perspective, but you do not feel obligated to convince them. Your understanding of your own direction is sufficient. This change also appears in how you handle criticism. Earlier, criticism could trigger an immediate explanation. You wanted to show that the criticism was incomplete or that the person misunderstood the situation. Now you listen more quietly. Sometimes a criticism contains useful insight. Sometimes it doesn't. But either way, your sense of worth is not determined by the opinion. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity reduces the ego's need to defend itself constantly. When the ego is fragile, it must protect its image at every opportunity. When the ego becomes integrated, it no longer depends on maintaining a perfect image. It can tolerate misunderstanding. It can tolerate disagreement. It can even tolerate being underestimated, because its stability no longer comes from perception. It comes from internal alignment. This does not mean you stop communicating your ideas. You still speak clearly. You still share your perspective when it matters. But the motivation behind the communication changes. You are no longer speaking to secure approval. You are speaking to express truth. And if someone does not accept that truth, you remain calm, because your identity is no longer under negotiation. Another place where this shift becomes visible is in competitive environments. Earlier, comparison might have triggered the need to demonstrate competence, to highlight your achievements, to prove your capability. But as individuation progresses, that urgency begins to fade. You still work hard. You still pursue excellence. But you no longer feel compelled to display your worth constantly. Your work speaks for itself. And when recognition arrives, it feels pleasant, but not necessary. Carl Jung believed that the deeper self eventually becomes the reference point for identity. When the ego aligns with this inner center, external comparison loses its psychological power. You are no longer measuring yourself against every person in the room. You are simply measuring your actions against your own values. This creates a different kind of confidence, not loud confidence, not performative confidence, but quiet certainty, the kind that does not rush to defend itself, the kind that does not require constant explanation, because it already knows where it stands. And once this quiet certainty begins to stabilize inside you, something surprising happens. The need to prove yourself gradually disappears. Not because you stop caring about your life, but because you finally stopped asking the world to confirm who you already know you are. Think about how many conversations used to quietly turn into explanations. Someone questioned your decision. Someone misunderstood something you did. Someone assumed something about your intentions that wasn't accurate. And before long, you found yourself clarifying the entire situation. You explained your reasoning. You added details. You described the context. Not because you enjoyed defending yourself, but because something inside you wanted the record corrected. You wanted the other person to see the full picture. You wanted them to understand that your decision had meaning behind it. This reaction often felt reasonable. After all, misunderstanding can be uncomfortable. Most people prefer to be seen accurately rather than misinterpreted. But if you observe these moments closely, you may notice that the explanation was often doing more than correcting information. It was protecting identity. When the ego still depends heavily on external perception, misunderstanding feels threatening. If someone interprets your actions incorrectly, the ego feels exposed. If someone questions your ability, the ego feels challenged. If someone doubts your intentions, the ego feels misrepresented. And so the psyche moves quickly to repair the image. Carl Jung believed that much of this behavior is driven by the ego's early need for recognition. When identity is still consolidating, the ego depends on external mirrors to confirm who it is. Other people's reactions provide feedback. Approval strengthens confidence. Understanding stabilizes identity. But misunderstanding destabilizes it, because if the mirror reflects something inaccurate, the ego fears that the reflection might become the truth. So it intervenes. It explains. It corrects. It defends. Earlier in life, this process can become almost automatic. You may notice it in everyday situations. Someone misinterprets a comment you made, and you quickly clarify what you meant. Someone questions a choice you made, and you outline the logic behind it. Someone doubts your ability, and you mention past accomplishments. None of these behaviors appear dramatic, but over time, they can create a pattern. Your worth becomes something that must be communicated repeatedly. Your intentions become something that must be clarified constantly. Your competence becomes something that must be demonstrated again and again. This dynamic can become exhausting without you even realizing it, because every misunderstanding becomes a task. Every doubt becomes a conversation. Every criticism becomes a moment requiring explanation. Carl Jung believed that individuation slowly dissolves its dependence on external reflection. As identity becomes internally organized, the ego stops negotiating its worth in every interaction. Instead of trying to correct every perception, you begin accepting a difficult but liberating truth. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone will interpret your actions correctly. Not everyone will recognize your intentions. Earlier, this reality might have felt unacceptable. You wanted to be seen clearly. You wanted people to know who you really were. Now, something inside you becomes calmer about that uncertainty. Someone may misunderstand your decision. You clarify once if necessary, but you do not feel compelled to keep explaining. Someone may question your direction. You listen, but you do not feel obligated to persuade them. Someone may misinterpret your silence or your boundaries, and instead of rushing to justify yourself, you allow the misunderstanding to exist. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity includes the ability to tolerate being misunderstood. This does not mean embracing misinterpretation intentionally, but it means recognizing that perception is always filtered through another person's psychology. People see you through their own experiences, their own assumptions, their own expectations, and no amount of explanation can guarantee that they will see you exactly as you see yourself. Earlier, the ego might have tried to manage this, to control the narrative, to ensure that your identity was understood correctly in every interaction. Now the energy behind that effort begins to fade. You realize that your life does not need unanimous interpretation. It only needs internal coherence. This shift becomes especially visible in situations involving disagreement. Earlier, disagreement could trigger long explanations. You wanted the other person to see the reasoning behind your position. You wanted them to recognize that your perspective had depth. Now, disagreement feels different. You can express your view clearly, but if the other person does not accept it, the conversation ends without urgency. You do not feel compelled to prove that your position is valid, because your confidence in it no longer depends on their agreement. Carl Jung believed that when the ego becomes aligned with the self, identity stops being negotiated socially. The individual becomes guided by internal principles rather than collective validation. This alignment produces a form of quiet confidence. You do not need to persuade everyone in the room. You do not need to correct every assumption about you. You do not need to explain every choice you make. You simply live according to your understanding. And when explanation becomes necessary, you offer it calmly. But you no longer feel obligated to defend your existence through constant justification. This change often surprises people around you. They may notice that you explain less, that you defend yourself less, that you allow certain conversations to end without resolution. But internally, the shift feels like relief. Relief from the pressure of maintaining a perfectly understood identity. Relief from the endless effort of managing perception. Relief from the belief that your worth must be demonstrated repeatedly. Carl Jung believed that individuation eventually creates a center of gravity within the psyche. Once that center forms, identity becomes self-referenced rather than externally negotiated. You know your intentions. You know your values. You know your direction. And that internal knowing becomes stronger than the need for external confirmation. Because of that, conversations change. You speak honestly, but you do not argue endlessly. You explain when necessary, but you do not justify your existence. You listen to criticism, but you do not collapse under it. And gradually, you realize that the energy once spent proving yourself is no longer required. Your worth no longer needs to be defended. It simply exists. Quietly, steadily, without negotiation. Pay attention to how differently you move through environments where people are trying to stand out. A meeting at work, a group discussion, a social setting where everyone is subtly demonstrating their achievements, their opinions, their competence. Earlier in life, situations like these could quietly activate something inside you, not necessarily competition, but awareness. You became conscious of how you were being perceived. You chose your words carefully. You tried to contribute something insightful. You might mention an experience, a result, or a skill that communicated your capability. It was rarely obvious. Often it was subtle. But beneath the conversation, there was a quiet effort to ensure that your value was visible. Carl Jung believed that when the ego is still stabilizing, it often tries to secure recognition through performance. The ego wants to be seen as competent, relevant, capable, because those signals reassure the psyche that it has a place within the collective. In social environments, this can create a constant background activity. You monitor the conversation. You measure how your contributions compare to others. You look for opportunities to demonstrate understanding, not necessarily to dominate the discussion, but to confirm that you belong there. This pattern is extremely common. In fact, many professional and social environments are structured around it. People subtly advertise their accomplishments. They highlight the importance of their work. They mention their achievements at the right moment in conversation. From the outside, it can appear like confidence, but psychologically it is often something else. It is the ego seeking validation. Carl Jung observed that when the ego feels uncertain about its place in the world, it compensates through performance. Performance becomes a way of proving worth, and proving worth becomes a way of protecting identity. But individuation gradually changes this relationship with performance. As identity consolidates internally, the pressure to demonstrate value begins to dissolve. You may notice this shift especially in environments where people compete for recognition. Earlier, you might have felt the need to participate in that dynamic, to ensure your voice was heard, to make sure your ideas were acknowledged. Now, something inside you becomes quieter. You still contribute when you have something meaningful to say, but you no longer feel the urgency to prove that you are intelligent. You no longer feel the need to emphasize your experience. You no longer feel compelled to establish your position in every room you enter. Your sense of worth has moved away from performance. Carl Jung believed that when the ego begins aligning with the self, identity becomes internally confirmed rather than externally negotiated. In practical terms, this means something simple but powerful. You know what you bring. You know your abilities. You know your values. And that internal knowledge removes the pressure to display them constantly. This does not make you passive. You still work. You still pursue meaningful goals. You still speak when your perspective matters. But your motivation changes. You are no longer acting in order to be recognized. You are acting because the action itself aligns with who you are. The difference may seem small from the outside, but internally, it feels entirely different. Earlier, action often carried a secondary question. How will this make me appear? Now the question becomes simpler. Is this worth doing? That shift removes enormous psychological pressure. Because once your actions are guided by internal alignment rather than external approval, comparison loses its influence. You stop measuring yourself against everyone around you. You stop evaluating your progress through someone else's achievements. You stop worrying about whether others recognize your effort. Carl Jung believed that comparison often emerges when the ego is still searching for confirmation. It uses external reference points to determine its own value. But when identity becomes internally grounded, comparison becomes less relevant. Your path belongs to you. Your pace belongs to you. Your development belongs to you. And this understanding changes how you move through competitive environments. You no longer feel compelled to stand out in every situation. You allow others to pursue recognition if they want it. You remain focused on the work that matters to you. Sometimes this quiet presence surprises people. They may expect you to participate more actively in self-promotion. They may assume you should defend your expertise more strongly. But internally, something is already settled. You know what you are capable of. You know what you are building. And that internal certainty reduces the need for display. Carl Jung once described individuation as the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who the world expects you to be. That process often removes the motivation behind many social performances. Because once identity is anchored internally, external applause becomes optional rather than necessary. Recognition can still be appreciated, but it no longer determines your sense of worth. This is why quiet confidence often appears during later stages of psychological development. Not loud confidence, not performative confidence, but calm certainty. You do not rush to explain your achievements. You do not compete for attention. You do not prove your intelligence through constant demonstration. You simply live your life according to your own understanding. Carl Jung believed that when the ego becomes integrated, it stops trying to defend itself against every perceived challenge. Instead, it rests in a deeper psychological center. That center provides stability even when recognition is absent, even when others misunderstand your intentions, even when someone else receives more attention. Because your identity is no longer organized around the need to prove your worth. It is organized around a quiet knowledge that your worth already exists. And once that knowledge becomes stable, the impulse to perform begins to fade. You still contribute. You still participate. You still grow. But you do so without the silent pressure that once accompanied every interaction. The pressure to prove that you deserve your place in the room. Because now you understand something that once felt uncertain. You do not need to prove that you belong. You already do. Eventually, a quiet realization settles into the way you move through the world. You no longer feel the same internal pressure to demonstrate who you are. You still speak when something matters. You still express your perspective when it contributes to the situation. But the subtle tension that once followed every misunderstanding, every doubt, every moment of comparison has begun to fade. Earlier in life, the need to prove yourself often appeared in small ways. You clarified your intentions so people would see you correctly. You defended your decisions so they would appear reasonable. You highlighted your effort so it would be recognized, not because you were trying to impress anyone, but because being seen accurately felt important. Carl Jung believed that when the ego is still searching for its place, it relies heavily on external reflection. Recognition from others becomes a mirror through which the individual understands their own value. Agreement feels stabilizing. Approval feels reassuring. Understanding feels validating. But when identity depends on these mirrors, life becomes continuous negotiation. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to defend your perspective. Every criticism becomes a challenge to your worth. Every misunderstanding becomes something that must be corrected. Individuation gradually dissolves that structure. As the psyche integrates its deeper layers, the ego no longer needs constant confirmation from the outside world. Your sense of value becomes internally referenced rather than socially negotiated. You know your intentions. You know the effort behind your choices. You know the direction you are moving toward. And that knowledge removes the urgency to convince everyone else. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity allows a person to tolerate disagreement, misunderstanding, and even underestimation without feeling destabilized. Not because those experiences are pleasant, but because they no longer threaten identity. Your worth is no longer something that must be defended in every room you enter. It becomes something quieter, something stable, something that exists independently of applause or recognition. This does not mean you stop striving for excellence. You still care about the quality of your work. You still pursue meaningful goals. You still engage with the world thoughtfully, but your motivation changes. You are no longer working to prove your value. You are working because the work itself reflects who you are. Recognition may still come. Respect may still appear. But they are no longer the foundation of your confidence. They are simply responses from the outside world. Carl Jung often described individuation as a movement toward inner authority, a point where the individual becomes guided by internal clarity rather than external approval. When that authority emerges, something inside you relaxes. You stop performing for validation. You stop defending your existence. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You simply live in alignment with what you understand to be true. And that quiet alignment carries a form of confidence that does not need to prove anything. Before we close, take a moment to reflect honestly. Can you remember a situation where you realized you no longer felt the need to prove yourself? Maybe someone misunderstood you. Maybe someone doubted your direction. Maybe someone questioned your ability. And instead of rushing to defend yourself, you simply remain calm. Share that moment in the comments. Someone else reading your experience may recognize the same shift happening in their own life. And if this video helped you understand a psychological change you've been feeling recently, share it with someone who might also be discovering what quiet confidence looks like. Because one of the clearest signs of individuation is not becoming louder. It is realizing that you no longer need to prove who you are. You simply know